Hi, and welcome back to Tuba People TV, where we talk about all things Arnold Jacobs all of the time. Puddles and I are here in the lovely Tubi studio at University of Oregon in Eugene, Oregon, with a very dear friend who's not old, but I would call you an old friend, though you're not old.
Long time.
Long-time friend. Yeah, very long time.
Yes.
Since 1980.
Even before that, at the
79?
maybe 79 at the Linfield workshop.
The brass workshop.
Yeah.
Pete Ellefson.
Michael Gross.
What up?
It's great to be here.
Great to have you here. Pete is here with the faculty member of the Alessi Seminar here at the University of Oregon. There are trombones aplenty all over our School of Music this week. And I have to say, it's been a wonderful time to have you here.
Well, it's been great to be back to Oregon. I mean, as you know, I'm from Oregon. I was born about 70 miles from here and grew up 90 miles from here. And, well, let me rephrase that. I aged from, year 0 to year 21 in the state of Oregon. I wouldn't say that I grew up.
I think you grew up with me in Chicago. That's when you really
yes,
grew
I
up.
would
Wouldn't
say
you
that's. I would say that's where I made most of my growing up progress. Yeah.
I remember several growing up incidents.
Oh, experiences.
Experiences?
Incidents has kind of a negative connotation to
Okay.
it, and we wouldn't want to spin it that way.
No,
Yeah.
experiences.
Yeah.
All right, very good. Well, Pete and I played in the Portland Youth Philharmonic together in Portland for, I think we overlapped one season, and then I went off to Northwestern, and you finished up your bachelor's at Linfield College,
Mm-hmm.
studying with Warren Baker, and then somehow I was able to help you in your decision making to come to Northwestern for the master's, and we did our master's together.
Yes,
That was
and
very fun.
I have to tell you that had we not had that relationship and that that opportunity for me, I wouldn't be sitting here now. I was very pivotal to go to Northwestern, and the one person I have to thank for the encouragement of that is you. So publicly, thank you, Michael Gross.
You're very welcome, and it was a great time for me.
Yeah.
We had a wonderful couple of years together.
Yeah, I think about those times a lot. They were very, very important to me.
Yeah. And as I recall, amidst all of your other teachers from which you studied in your career, which I'd actually like to talk more about those
I'm
at some
happy to
point
talk
in this
about
interview.
Yeah.
You did have, as I recall, you had a lesson with Mr. Jacobs, and you watched a lesson
Mhm.
with Mr. Jacobs. I'm
Correct.
just wondering what you recall from those two times.
Well, I have to preface that by saying that when you moved to Chicago, and particularly in that era, you were constantly aware of the influence and the importance of Arnold Jacobs. Chicago at that time was, and continues to be, but particularly at that time, was you had, if you were a brass player, a serious brass player, in my opinion, you had to go through Chicago and experience the Chicago Symphony, and the pedagogy of Arnold Jacobs was so important, and so it was everywhere, and it permeated all instruments, and there was just that there he was, and to be in the same town as, in my opinion, the greatest brass teacher of the 20th century was pivotal and important, and it was significant to be there at that time.
Yeah, it was a pretty magical time, and I say that knowing that it'd be easy for anybody to say that about their particular time and
Sure,
in
of course.
many locations, but
That's the way we work. Wherever we are, that's the most important thing.
yeah,
Exactly.
exactly. But I think there was something when you talk to other people, and certainly during doing this project, it has Mr. Jacobs and his work, his persona as well as his work. I knew him certainly as a three-dimensional character, having studied with him and thought about him, for the last 35 years. But during this project, I've learned things about him that have really made him like four-dimensional. It's just amazing to me.
What would those dimensions be?
Well, just the scope, how wide a net that he cast in terms of his teaching.
Sure.
We were just talking off camera about the time we had with Lou Soloff and how Mr. Soloff was really taken with my daughter Emily, who's running the camera right now.
Thank you, Emily. You're
You're
doing a great
welcome.
job.
But
Ask for a raise.
I want to raise.
Okay.
But he had, it was astonishing to me to find out that Mr. Soloff, while he was in Blood, Sweat, and Tears, was flying in monthly for lessons with Jacobs. And that just,
He could afford it.
he could afford it. But he wanted to. He wanted to go study with his tuba player.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah, I mean, he was in this, he was number one on the charts. And yet he was
Yeah,
studying
that's
with
great.
his tuba
That
guy.
says volumes about Lou too.
It does.
Yeah.
It really does. Do you remember in either the lesson you observed was my lesson?
It was.
Do you remember and your lesson? What do you remember about those 2 hours? Anything that you took away from them? Or?
Absolutely. And the first thing that I remember is we were sitting waiting to go into your lesson, and the door of his studio had a window in it that was fogged out or something. Correct?
Yeah.
And I remember in order to get his attention, you had a cup of coffee and would walk back and forth. So if Mr. Jacobs was sitting in his studio and noticing, he would see this shadow walking back and forth with this cup of coffee.
Cream and sugar.
So that's the first thing I remember. It's like, wow, that's a kind of an interesting way to get your teacher's attention, that it's time for your lesson. But that you and that coffee cup just walked back and forth.
I forgot about that.
And sitting in your lesson, I think truthfully, and I think if people were to be honest about their first lessons and their first exposure to Arnold Jacobs, you miss a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Because number one, you're in awe of being in that space with this teacher,
Mm-hmm.
and he is very, very efficient with his use of words, and so it's like a lot of it goes by, and you're like, I mean, it all makes sense at the time, but I found that my brain had trouble keeping up,
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
and this also manifested later on when I tried to transcribe some of his master classes at Northwestern. I thought, oh, it would be a great service if I were to transcribe these, and I got about 20 minutes in, and I realized this is going to be a daunting task, because he was as efficient with his words as with his playing, and he was very practiced about the way that he would go about these things. And so being in there, I mean, I envy you folks that were able to take lesson after lesson with him, because after a time, then you start to sort of digest his language and his vernacular.
Right.
Whereas if you're just coming into it, it's kind of overloading. I mean, it's kind of it's tough to process everything. So
Yeah.
so that and I was happy to be in the room listening to that voice of his and that resonance of his voice, and this great way that he spoke, and so it was great to be with you, my friend, watching a lesson, and thank you for allowing me to be there, because that's it's difficult to have somebody watch your lesson, but you were kind enough to allow me to do that, and I appreciate that so much. And later, somewhat later, I had a lesson with him, and I was able to wrangle a lesson with him, because it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to get on his schedule, and I probably from some help from you, I was able to get a lesson, and it was a quite amazing experience. And I can talk about more of that in just a little bit. But one thing that I remember very clearly is, as soon as I left his studio, I went and sat down on the steps, on the set of steps there at the Fine Arts Building, and I started writing. And it was it was orange. I still have it in a folder somewhere.
Do you really?
It was a back cover of something, and I just started writing down everything I remembered from that hour.
Wow.
And I would refer to those notes later on. There was one aspect of my playing in particular that I wanted help with. And so, and he, of course, zeroed in on that without me having to tell him what it was. He was able to zero in on that. I think a lot of my first lesson, I think many of the first lessons with him perhaps were somewhat introductory and somewhat, the same the same procedures that he would, but he was able to address what I needed to have addressed, and gave me specific exercises, which was lovely of him, Al Schlossberg, to help, and I'll always remember another instance in my lesson, and he says, "Open your mouth." And so I opened my mouth, and he had a flashlight in there looking at me, and he goes, "Oh, an unusually large uvula." I'm thinking,
Maybe we should
okay,
take a look.
there we go. So I have an unusually large uvula. So there you go.
Wow.
If there's any like movie role that needs something like that, I'm your guy.
Do you care to recall or talk about what it was that you wanted assistance with? And,
Oh, sure.
And what he did.
Listen, the great thing about getting to be my age is, I really don't care about talking about my weaknesses or my journey, because, why not share the information? Why not share your weaknesses and how you overcame them? And so, no, I don't mind at all. I would get, I would experience segmentation, or rant, or double vibration, whatever you want to talk about, primarily on A at the top of the staff, which is unfortunate for the Mahler Third Symphony.
Right.
But it would happen sometimes there, but very frequently on F sharp below that. And come to find out, that's a very common. Those few notes right there is very common for people to suffer from that segmentation, and it had become such a bother to me that I would get a piece of music put in front of me, and the first thing that I would do is I would look to see if there were any fortissimo F sharps. There was a paranoia that had set in on that, and when I played some things for him, and the first thing he told me, he goes, "You're protecting your high register." So what I was doing is I was taking my procedures and what I was doing in the upper register and transferring that down low, instead of developing how to play in the low register and transferring that up. And so it's a very simple concept, but I needed him to tell me that. And so I would say that's what I got out of it mostly. And he gave me, like I said, some Schlossberg exercises. And everybody still rants once in a while, but I was so happy to, and it didn't happen immediately, but 6 months or a year later, I forgot that I ever had those issues. So
he had you taking, letting the lower note teach the upper note.
Exactly.
Taking the
Right.
lower air,
Right.
maybe,
Right.
or
Right.
the lower sound.
Yeah, because as brass players, we're all frequently concerned with, playing high and playing clear and high and loud, and which is kind of funny on a trombone, because our high notes really aren't that high, to the ear. But boy,
Exactly.
and of course using what Mr. Jacobs would say, it's like, you'll see, the excitement is created by the sweat and signs of physical distress, but it's really still only a mid-range note. And so, so once we get over the ego part and just learn how to do things right, it made a huge difference.
That's so interesting. I had the very same problem going to Chicago.
It's an Oregon thing.
It must be West Coast.
Oh, West Coast. Okay, fine.
And so my very first experience with him was at my civic audition, and I had this segmentation problem, say from G at the bottom of the staff to D in the staff. And what was the very first thing I had to play for him? The solo from Meistersinger, starting on C, G, G, G.
Perfect.
Yes, perfect.
Yeah. Hello.
So
Here we are.
The audition was shortly over, and my first lesson in the basement of Orchestra Hall began.
Uh-huh.
And they continued at the Fine Arts Building shortly thereafter.
That's funny. That's great.
Yeah. But it was a very similar experience. He didn't tell me I was protecting my high register, because I didn't have a high register at that point. And I remember that you did. You came to Chicago, came to Northwestern, and really tore it up with your great technique, your very clear sound, your excellent high register, and just being able to be a wonderful musician with all of those things intact.
Thank you.
Whereas, there were some other people like you there, but there was a lot of more of the lumbering trombonist examples.
Yeah.
Anything else about Mr. Jacobs? I'd love to hear about some of your other teachers, if there's anything else that you'd like to mention.
Well, I just have to say, as we sort of move on to other teachers, but I feel very, very fortunate to have just had one lesson with Arnold Jacobs, and those folks that were fortunate enough to have more than one lesson, and I think we were very seldom are we in the presence of true greatness, and I really felt that, and I would never consider myself a student of his. I mean, yes, in that I was a beneficiary of his teachings, mm-hmm. but I would never saddle him with the title of my private teacher. You know what I mean?
Yeah, of course.
So I'm very happy to have had that experience, to have spent that time with him.
I don't know if you remember this. I do, but we must have done a home and home setup, because you came and observed a lesson with me, and I remember observing a lesson with you and Mr. Crisafulli.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you and I must have been very explicit in wanting to get some trading.
It's a long time ago. I don't remember everything.
It was a long time ago.
Yeah. I remember a lot of things, but I probably don't remember everything. But remember, an Ellefson never forgets.
Unfortunately, what he is prone to forget, he has on tape somewhere. So.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah. I'm going to let you make your first million before I start revealing that.
Well, Pete, so Northwestern was our graduate studies together. Prior to that, you were at Linfield, and prior to that, you were obviously at South Umpqua High School.
South Umpqua High School.
And there was a very special person who was the head of the music department at South Umpqua High School.
Sure.
Who was that?
Well, it wasn't. I guess it was a music department, and being the head of it just meant that you're the band director.
Yeah.
But that was my father, my dad, and I was fortunate because in this town of 2,500 that I grew up, the New York Philharmonic or the Chicago Symphony or the Cleveland Orchestra doesn't have Myrtle Creek on their tour list.
Right.
But we did have a record player, and so I was able to listen to recordings, and my dad was great about making sure that I had good recordings. The recordings I remember early on were, Irby Green. I wouldn't be playing trombone if it weren't for Irby Green.
Mm-hmm.
And listening to Irby Green play, and I think that has a lot to do with the my success playing in the high register, because I listened to Irby Green and I figured everybody can do that. Why not? Mm-hmm. So I was copying Irby Green when I was 10 years old and 12 years old and so on. I was playing the trombone solo from Somewhere, the Buddy Rich West Side Story. In 6th grade, I was playing that on a bass trombone, because I was given a trombone, but they didn't tell me it was a bass trombone. So I started on a bass trombone with a 3G mouthpiece, playing it like a tenor trombone. Now, I'm not sure I'd recommend doing that, but again, I think that helped me, develop endurance and upper register and so on. Didn't do much for my bass trombone playing, of which I am horrible, and I don't even attempt. I don't own a bass trombone, nor probably will I ever, because I'm just not very good at that. So my dad was wonderful in that our bands were better than they had a right to be. No one took lessons. No one took private lessons. But it was just, he had the guiding motivation of excellence, and so on. He instilled that in his band, and it's strange having your father as a director, but it makes you behave.
Yeah.
And that's okay. I wasn't an angel, and I got I had my chain yanked a few times in front of other people, which is good. You need that when you're a kid.
Well, he must have been just a tremendous musician to be able to get such good quality out of the band, where the individual components maybe weren't as strong as, say, in the Portland metro area or up in Salem, but he could get them to sound.
He was a wonderful teacher. He was a wonderful motivator, and everybody was afraid of him.
There you go, old school.
He was old school, and it was, and this is what people tell me in there. I run into people that that were contemporaries of mine, and they say, "We were afraid," and I'm thinking, really? Why would you be afraid? But they were, because he was very serious, and he wouldn't put up with messing around, and so that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
And in those days, these days you could never get away with that because you are squelching their spirit, and you're, everybody needs an A and all that. That wasn't
Right.
the case back then.
Everybody gets a ribbon.
Yeah, that's right. There are no losers.
Everybody's
a winner.
Yeah, exactly.
There you go.
What about your time at Linfield with with Bake? Warren
Yes,
Baker?
Warren Baker. I attended Linfield College, which is a small liberal arts college in McMinnville, Oregon, which is between Portland and Salem. I would say the reason that I went to Linfield was because of Warren Baker. He was, we call him Bake. Bake was the principal trombonist of the Oregon Symphony and had been for decades. And Linfield is a liberal arts college, as I said, and I would never trade my liberal arts education for anything.
Mm-hmm.
I know a little bit about a lot of things, and I would recommend that for everybody. Sometimes I feel sorry for people that go to a conservatory, because they're studying one thing very, very, very intensely, and the horizon ends up being somewhat narrow.
Yeah.
Whereas if you go to a liberal arts college, you learn about the world and how it works and how to interact with other people. And it's a great. I had a religion class and a biology class, and I didn't have to take a math class because my SAT score was high enough. I didn't. And for my language, I took computer programming.
Hey, the good old days.
The good old days, yeah, when that was considered a language.
Yeah.
And I took writing classes and speaking classes, and I just felt I got a great education at Linfield College. Those of you looking to get a fine liberal arts education, Linfield College. Studying with Warren Baker. Warren Baker was a student of Thomas Beversdorf, who was the famous composer and trombone teacher at Indiana University. And so much of what Bake's pedagogy represented, he learned from Thomas Beversdorf. Mm-hmm. And it's all about, my first lesson, play Marsteller, page 6, number 1. Play 5 notes in a row with the same attack, the same body, and the same release. Well, that probably took me a year to figure that out, because I hadn't had any lessons. You can't forget, I'm coming from a small town, and I was all over the instrument. But to actually have the discipline to play in this way was very challenging. Mm-hmm. And something else you might not know about me is I was going to go to Linfield for 2 years, transfer to Indiana, go study with David Baker, because I wanted to be a jazz player, and because I wanted to be in the Tonight Show band. Mm-hmm. The old Tonight Show,
the old
Johnny
Tonight
Carson.
Show. Yeah,
because I love that band. It's like I want to be in the Tonight Show band. And so I figured, well, I'll go to Linfield, get some classical training, go to Indiana, get some jazz training, move to LA, and take the world by storm. Well, it didn't exactly turn out that way. I went to Linfield, and I got in the Portland Youth Philharmonic, which is where we had our, sitting next to each other a couple times a week, and I learned how difficult it was to play classical trombone really well. Mm-hmm. And during that, I also started to do some jazz study, and I realized that playing jazz trombone, that's even more difficult. Mm-hmm. And so, being sort of set up the lazy person that I am, I decided to pursue an orchestral trombone career instead of a jazz trombone career. Okay. So, I did my 4 years at Linfield with Warren Baker, and then it came time to go to graduate school, and you and I, of course, had kept in touch during that time, and the opportunity to go to Northwestern was presented itself, and a little bit of an interesting story there too. At that time, while I was at Linfield, I attended the Empire Brass Quintet Symposium at Tanglewood, and I heard Mark Lawrence was the trombone player at that time, and Mark was the first world-class trombone player that I'd ever heard, and he made an incredible impact on me that lasts to this day. And Mark and I are good friends now, and I hold Mark in the absolute highest esteem, as far as just being a classy guy and a great player and a great teacher, and he was the first one that I was, and so he was very important to me. Then Mark was only in the Empire Brass for 1 year, and then his replacement was Larry Isaacson, mm-hmm. and Larry was a teacher a player that had gone to Northwestern, right? And Larry was teaching at BU at the time, and Larry. Larry was interested in having me come to BU to study with him, and I remember there was a phone call that I had with Larry who said, I'd love to have you come and study with me at Boston University. He says, but you know what? You should go and study where I studied. You should go to Northwestern and study with Frank Crisafulli. And I'll forever be in Larry's debt. And I've told Larry several times over the years. I said, there's something you told me that has really stuck with me, but I've actually never told him what it was. And so he's like, what was that I said,
I'll tell you later.
I'll tell you sometime. So I appreciate Larry's candor and the fact that he really had my best interests at heart, rather than, yes, I'd love to have you there, and of course I can teach you things, I can make you a better player, and being around Boston, all that would be great for you, but you should go where I went to school.
Yeah.
So I went to Northwestern. Being at Northwestern was really the catalyst for sending me off into my career. My lessons with Frank Crisafulli, I would say the most amazing thing about them was the best playing I did all week was in my lessons with him. The rest of the week was spent trying to capture whatever it was I did in that hour.
Mm-hmm.
Because he had this way about him, and those of you that know him and were fortunate enough to have studied with him, he was so encouraging, and it's like you could hardly do anything wrong with him. You could never do anything wrong. He might suggest, try it this way or try it that way, but every note you played, he made you feel like it was gold, and which is quite a change from a lot of teachers, where every note that you play, let's just say it's not gold.
Not gold.
But he had this really easy way about him, because he loved to teach. He loved his students. And I think that was really what he truly loved to do. Yes, he played in the Chicago Symphony for 50 years or however, and I think he perhaps wasn't the happiest guy at work. I think it was a difficult time to be there, and he wasn't without being part of that whole dissatisfaction or whatever. But his student, he would light up around his students.
He sure did.
And he was like Santa Claus, really, and he just had this gentle, grandfatherly way about him. And of course, going over to dinner at his house, we all have been there. That his students of his have been to his house, and Mrs. Crisafulli, Dorothy, would make these wonderful dinners, and he would sit there with a cat on his lap, the cat on his lap, and he'd give food to the cat on his lap, and so, and the sound that he made. And he didn't. This is before the days of this gargantuan equipment that everybody seems to want to play now.
Right.
And you listen to the sound of the Chicago Symphony at that time, the low brass and the brass section, but the low brass in particular, it's electric.
Electric.
I mean, that sound jumped. And a couple summers ago, I was playing planets with CSO, and Jay Friedman and I went out and had lunch, and I brought this up to him. I said, because I was sort of rediscovering what the orchestra was sounding like that bad. He goes, I know. He says, we don't play like that anymore. He says, and it wasn't a judgment call about which is better. It was just different. And it's like, you listen to that, and it's like, I said that Irby Green's the reason I play trombone. Well, it is. But the reason I, play orchestral trombone is because of the Chicago Symphony at that time, and the sound that the trombones made, and the low brass, and Herseth, of course, and Mr. Clevenger, of course. But that sound, and Crisafulli in particular was not playing large equipment. He was playing, 51C4 more or less, or 5GS more or less, that size equipment. As was Glenn Dodson at that time, 5GS-ish type size. And it wasn't big, but boy, these guys could play.
Yeah.
They could really play, and it wasn't this sort of wide sound that we have now. And I've been talking about this at the seminar all week, this wide, shallow sound. It was a narrower, deeper, more colorful sound, and I'm in particular I have tried to hold that standard up, where the basic sound of the trombone doesn't sound like a euphonium.
Yeah, or a tuba.
Right. I want it to sound like a conical bore, with more zip and more brilliance in the sound. So anyway, playing duets with Mr. Crisafulli was, and I arranged that for my lesson each week. I had a formula. We're going to play duets. I learned a new Bordoni. There were the Rochus at that point, Bordoni Rochu. I challenged myself to learn a new one out of the end of book 2, book 3 each week, and then we would work on whatever excerpts for the auditions and whatever solo repertoire we would do, and then that would be it. But I insisted on playing duets with him because of that sound of his. And if you go back and listen to those recordings, his sound printed.
It did, and I think an emblematic example of Mr. Crisafulli's sound, you can hear on the 1973 Bruckner 4 with Barenboim, just in that first movement where there's that well-known second trombone moving passage.
Yeah.
I mean, that's all Crisafulli, and it's like, holy cow.
Yeah, and he didn't work. He never looked like he was working. He was so efficient with what he was doing, and it's just, the sound. It really, and again, all of you that have been in the same room with him know what I'm talking about. That is core. It's just core of sound. It wasn't overblown. It was just the right amount of work effort that created this core.
It was a great bridge between Friedman and Kleinhammer.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That sound.
Yeah, and it's wonderful to go back, and a lot of these concerts have been re-released on DVD, and to just capture that electric sound. It's just fantastic to watch those guys at work. Yeah.
What about moving on? You went to graduate school. You met Mr. Alessi also. What are those experiences?
Yes, sure. I first met Joe Alessi in 1986, and it was when the New York Philharmonic was on tour, and they stopped and played a couple concerts at Ravinia, and I heard them play the Tchaikovsky Six with Bernstein.
I remember that.
And
yes,
that's again
that was something.
When my life changed.
Yeah,
was hearing the amount of sound that was coming out of that back row of that orchestra. Incredible, and seeing Bernstein up there in his white jumpsuit, that was also remarkable. And that recording, the recording that was made on the Deutsche Grammophon label of the Tchaikovsky Six was at that time, and it's monumental.
It is.
Yeah, it's incredible the amount of sound. Warren Deck,
holy cow.
And that great New York Philharmonic low brass section. It was terrific. So that's when I first met Joe Alessi. But then we didn't become reacquainted again until 10 or 13, I guess 13 years later was when
late 90s.
Yeah, late 90s is when. But I had followed his playing through radio broadcasts. Remember what a radio is? The radio broadcast.
Is that an app on the phone?
Yeah, probably.
Get sidetracked.
Yeah. But I have all those cassette tapes of those radio broadcasts. I have hundreds of cassette tapes that I'm in the process of digitizing.
Fantastic.
That was last sabbatical project and next sabbatical project, and so on and so forth. So so that's when I began my association with Mr. Alessi was actually in 1999. And so between 1986 and 99, well, I guess in 1986. I moved away from Chicago in January of '87. Moved back to Oregon, and I taught for a few years. I taught school.
Middle school.
Yeah, I taught
public school.
That's right. I taught middle school taught public school for 3 years, and 1 year in Brookings, Oregon, which is the first town north of the California border in Oregon, and then 2 years in a suburb of Portland. And at that time, I got to work some extra with the Oregon Symphony and so on. And I won a couple of jobs along the way. I won a job as a trombone soloist of the Marine Band in D.C. And that was actually when I was in Chicago. You may remember that whole
I do remember that
whole situation.
Yes.
And which I didn't take that job. That was back in the days when they actually had a trombone soloist position. And then I also won a job in '89. I won it with the solo trombone with the orchestra in Barcelona.
That's right.
And I also didn't take that because I wanted an orchestra job in the United States. So call me provincial, but I wanted to be here. So, and then I did get a job in the Seattle. I went back to school. I figured I don't want to teach school for the rest of my life, public school, and so I maybe I'll go back and start studying a doctorate. Maybe I can get a college teaching job. And at that time, I went back to school at Indiana University, and then while I was there, I auditioned for the Seattle Symphony, and I got that job. So I got to come back to the Northwest. I got to play in a major symphony orchestra, second trombone, and that was another fantastic experience. I've been so fortunate to have one great experience after another great experience after another great experience, support from friends, colleagues, teachers, family,
Yeah.
and I've just been so fortunate along the way. It was wonderful being in the Seattle Symphony at that time because we did so much contemporary music. Gerard Schwartz was the music director, and we made many, many recordings, and I learned very, very valuable things during that time. And it was really thanks to the support of one of my colleagues, Stephen Fissel, that helped me know about the audition and helped me. And it was great to sit alongside him for that time. And so I played there for 10 years, and during that time, this is also when I met Mr. Alessi, and I attended the very first Alessi Seminar, which was in Nyack in 1999. I was a participant for that, and that another life-changing thing. And so that's why I feel so fortunate to be on the faculty of the Alessi Seminar, because I think this is the most important week in trombone, and I think Joe Alessi is our Tiger Woods, our Michael Jordan, our LeBron James. This is the guy that we look to, and he's been principal trombone in the New York Philharmonic for 30 years.
Yeah.
And there's nothing that he hasn't done. Album after album, he's really set the standard as far as trombone playing. And so in the early 2000s, I got a call from Indiana University. They were doing a trombone search, and they invited me to be part of that search to apply for the position. So I submitted my material. Well, first of all, I said, well, I had no thought that I would be teaching so early. And I said, let me think about it for a few days. And so I thought about it, and I thought, wow, I've been in the orchestra for 10 years at this point. I thought, wow, something this good might not come along again. I should pursue this. And then I also thought, there's no way I'll get it, but I wanted to go through the process, so later on in my life I would know what a search process was like. So I was doing it as an educational experience, and this it went through a couple of searches, but I ended up being offered this position. I was like, oh my gosh, and so I left the orchestra after 10 years. I left the orchestra to be a professor at Indiana University, which is a large music school. It's a very famous music school, and it has had a great trombone tradition over the years of the lineage of teachers there. And so I became on the faculty in 2002. I just finished my 13th year. I'm a full tenure professor and chairman of the brass department. It's like, be careful what you wish for, because these things end up happening. And as long as you stay positive and show up and pay attention, you never know the great things that are going to happen to you. Would I have any idea that I would be sitting in my teacher's chair? I did extensive subbing with the Chicago Symphony for the last 10 years or so. There I am sitting playing second trombone in the Chicago Symphony. I'm seeing the same view that Frank Crisafulli played. I play with the New York Philharmonic frequently, and when I play as a substitute for Mr. Alessi. So I'm sitting as first trombone in the New York Philharmonic, looking out and seeing. It's a very important concept to me, that sitting in my teacher's chair. Yeah. And here I am back in Oregon, sitting here with you and at the Alessi Seminar, and I couldn't be feel more fortunate to be doing everything that I'm doing.
Well, it's really great to have you here in Oregon for more than just a couple of days. You're here for 7-8 days or so.
It's the longest I've been in Oregon since I left.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's
So is it Oregon or Oregon? I can never remember.
Whatever.
Okay.
We had great times in the PYP, but then we really had some cutting our teeth moments in Chicago.
Absolutely.
And
we're so fortunate.
Yeah.
And find good colleagues when you're young. Good colleagues that you care about, that care about you, and that push you, and that will call BS on you when you're not doing your best.
That's right.
That's very, very important. To have somebody that will tell you that you can do better. And I felt like I had that colleague in you.
And you as well with me. So
yeah, I think that's a very important.
Greatly appreciate it. I think that's why we always stay in touch.
Yeah. Well, there's a mutual respect there, and we have this history too. And as you get older, you really value that history.
Part 2, we'll talk about the history.
No,
it'll be a private channel.
No, we won't.
Pay-per-view. Yeah. Puddles ordinarily love to give you some of his duck nuts, but this is his last can, and so he's a little bit low They supply.
Did you say duck nuts?
Yeah, duck nuts. These are University of Oregon duck nuts.
Huh. And you eat those?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. They're not force fed.
Oh, that's good.
Legal.
Well, this is Oregon.
Yeah, it's
after all.
legal.
That's right.
Oregon, yeah.
Okay.
So instead, he's asking me to give you this genuine University of Oregon Tuba People TV Puddles favorite channel tuba flask, otherwise known as a canteen.
Well, I think I might have more use for this than I would for duck nuts.
As you wish.
Great. So I happily accept this. I'd like to thank you. This is great, Mike. As always, it's great, and thank you, and we'll see you all down the road.
It's great to see you.
Great.
And now back to you.
P.S.
P.S. Pete.
P.S. Postscript, not public school.
Postscript.
Postscript. There's something that I neglected to mention. I get to talking sometimes, and I go in a particular direction, and I forget other things that I wanted to say. But when I started my doctorate at Indiana University, my teacher was Dee Stewart, who has a huge connection with Arnold Jacobs, of course. And one of the great privileges of my career now is to teach at Indiana University, the Jacobs School of Music, with my trombone colleagues are D Stewart, a former teacher, and Lenthe.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm very fortunate to have these great colleagues, as well as Dan Perantoni and Jeff Nelson, Dale Clevenger.
Yeah,
I mean, if you can believe I'm teaching, the person I used to go and idolize at Chicago Symphony. Now I'm the chair of his department. Be careful what you wish for.
Be careful what you wish for.
But I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that it was an important connection with D Stewart.
What do you think? What did you see in Mr. Stewart, the main Jacobs influence on D Stewart in terms of D Stewart's playing or teaching, for that matter?
Well, D Stewart has remarkable control. His soft playing is stunning, and his ease of delivery. This is his this mantra, this easy production, easy production, easy production. And one thing that blew me away was when I was studying with Professor Stewart at that time, was he was able to actually, his lips were so supple and so soft, he was able to make a very fine sound, sucking air in.
Oh, wow.
His lips, by pulling air across his lips, that it would vibrate the same way as it would vibrate if you sent it out the other way. And it's like, what value is that? Well, none, but it's amazing. And it's a tribute to how, his easy production, and he encourages that in all of his students. And so he, I didn't spend a long time studying with him, so, but I think that's the one thing I got from him is, take a breath, keep it simple, and keep it efficient. And the other great line I got from him are, work effort does not necessarily equal decibels.
Less is more.
Can be.
Can be.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he's a very fine teacher, and he's he's still going.
Yeah,
it's
amazing.
He's like the Energizer Bunny. He's in great shape, and and students are still benefiting from his pedagogy. So anyway, just a shout out to Dee.
Thanks.
Absolutely.